There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a story when the thing at its center is almost too large to picture. This is one of those stories. It begins not with a battle or a storm, but with a hull, a single wooden hull, laid down on a stretch of Scottish coastline at the turn of the 16th century, so vast that the men who built it left behind numbers that later generations would read twice. There had been nothing like her before in the northern kingdoms. There would not be anything quite like her again for a very long time. And in the telling that survived her, in the half-legend that grew up around her afterward, there is a claim that still unsettles anyone who hears it for the first time, that to build this one ship, a kingdom stripped its own forests bare. Whether that claim is entirely true is a question this story will sit with patiently, turning it over the way a shipwright might turn over a beam of oak, checking it for soundness before committing it to the hull. But the claim itself, true or exaggerated, tells us something important before a single plank has even been cut. It tells us that this ship was remembered less as a vessel and more as an event, something that happened to the land as much as to the sea. A ship that took a country's woodland and gave back, in exchange, a floating fortress unlike anything the age had seen. Her name was the Great Michael. She was built in Scotland in the opening years of the 1500s, under the order of a king who wanted, more than almost anything else, to be taken seriously by the great powers of Europe. His name was James IV, and his ambitions will occupy us at length very soon. For now, it is enough to place him where he belongs, on the throne of a small, proud, chronically underestimated kingdom on the northern edge of a continent that was, in those years, entering into an age of astonishing invention. Printing presses were spreading words faster than any scribe ever could. Sailors were returning from the edges of unknown oceans with stories that reshaped the maps. And kings, watching all of this unfold, were beginning to understand that power was no longer only measured in land and lineage. It was beginning to be measured in ships. Scotland, in the year the keel of the Great Michael was laid, was not a nation anyone associated with naval greatness. It had no tradition of building warships to rival the Mediterranean galleys of Genoa or Venice, no great arsenal like the one at the heart of the Venetian lagoon, no fleet to match the growing ambitions of England to the south, or the older maritime confidence of Portugal and Spain, whose ships were already reaching around the edges of the known world. Scotland was a kingdom of hard winters and harder politics, a land where the crown's authority often had to be renegotiated with every powerful family north of the Central Belt, where the church held enormous sway, and where the idea of matching the naval strength of a country like England seemed, on its face, almost absurd. And yet this is precisely what James IV set out to do. Not merely to build a navy that could hold its own, but to build, at its center, a single ship so large that its very existence would announce something to the rest of Europe, that this small northern kingdom, so often dismissed as peripheral, poor and quarrelsome, could produce a vessel to rival anything afloat. The ambition itself is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is easy, from the distance of 5 centuries, to treat it as simple vanity, a king's indulgence dressed up as strategy. But there was something more careful in it than that. A ship of this size was not only a weapon, a statement written in oak and iron, a physical argument that Scotland belonged in the company of the continent's great maritime powers, that it could not be dismissed, that its king's ambitions extended past the borders his predecessors had spent centuries merely defending. The wonder here is not simply that such a ship was built. It is that it was built at all by this kingdom. At this moment, a nation with a fraction of the resources and shipbuilding infrastructure of its rivals attempting something that outstripped in scale almost anything constructed anywhere in Europe up to that point. The historical record, patchy as it is in places, agrees on this much. When the Great Michael was finished, she was almost certainly the largest ship afloat on the seas of Europe, not the largest Scottish ship. Not the largest warship of her decade in these northern waters, the largest ship, full stop, built by hands answering to a crown that most of the continent still regarded as a minor power clinging to the edge of the map. It is worth pausing here, gently, on the paradox that will run beneath everything else in this story, because it deserves to be named before the timber is even felled. A ship of this size does not appear out of nothing. It is built from a resource that takes decades, sometimes centuries, to grow, and that a kingdom cannot simply conjure into being because a king desires a fleet. Oak, large enough and old enough to form the ribs and keel of a vessel, this size represents whole tracts of forest, grown slowly across generations, tended or simply left standing by accident of geography and neglect, and then, in the span of a few years, cut down entirely to answer one man's ambition. The legend that grew up around the Great Michael, that she consumed the forests of Fife, that whole woodlands vanished into her hull, may carry more folklore than legibbook accuracy. But legends like this rarely appear from nothing. They grow from a truth that felt large enough at the time to need retelling. Somewhere in the ordinary business of felling and hauling and shaping timber for this one extraordinary ship, something changed in the landscape of the kingdom that built her. That much, at least, seems to have been remembered as fact by the people who lived closest to it. This, then, is the shape of the story waiting ahead. Not simply the tale of a great ship, though she deserves that, telling in full her size, her guns, her rigging, the sheer strangeness of her presence on waters that had never held anything like her, but also the tale of what she cost, measured not only in the coin that drained from a royal treasury already stretched thin, but in the woodland that vanished to give her shape. Ambition in this story will be counted in timber, and the price of that ambition will be counted in the empty places where forests once stood. Before any of that can be understood properly, it helps to step back and stand for a moment in the Scotland that produced this king and this ship, a kingdom on the edge of the European Renaissance, absorbing its ideas a little late perhaps, but absorbing them all the same. It was a country of old alliances and older rivalries, bound to France through a friendship that had outlasted centuries, wary of England through a hostility nearly as old, governed by a monarch who read widely funded scholars, dabbled in medicine and alchemy, and who seems, from the fragments that survive of his character, to have possessed both a genuine curiosity about the wider world and a very personal hunger to be measured against its greatest rulers. It is into this world, restless, ambitious, reaching just slightly beyond its natural means, that the idea of the Great Michael was born. Not yet a ship, not yet even a keel. Only for now, an idea in the mind of a king who believed that Scotland could build something the rest of Europe would be forced to notice. What follows is the story of how that idea became timber, how that timber became a hull, larger than any harbour in the kingdom had ever been asked to hold, and how the forests of a small northern nation were asked in the end to answer for a king's dream of greatness. It is a story that begins quietly, in council rooms and shipyards, rather than on the open sea. But it carries within it, from these first pages, the same hush of astonishment that greeted the finished ship herself, the sense that something had been built which should not, by any reasonable expectation of the age, have been possible at all. To understand why such a ship could be imagined at all, one must first understand the man who imagined her. James IV of Scotland came to his throne as a boy of 15, in the aftermath of a conspiracy that had cost his own father the crown and the life to go with it. and he carried that inheritance with a restlessness that never quite left him. He was, by the accounts of those who knew him, a monarch of unusual curiosity, fluent in several languages, said to have dabbled in the extraction of teeth and the mixing of medicines, drawn to alchemy and astronomy with the same appetite he brought to falconry and the hunt. He kept scholars near him and corresponded with the learned men of the continent. He was, in the language of his own age, a Renaissance prince in a kingdom that had, until his reign, produced few of them. A ruler who understood that power in the 16th century was not only a matter of soldiers and treaties, but of instruments, of learning applied to iron and wood, of a court that could hold its own in the company of Paris, Bruges, and Rome. It was this appetite for instruments that drew him, early and lastingly, to artillery and to ships. The two were not separate enthusiasms in his mind, but a single project, for a gun was only as useful as the carriage that could bear it, and the timber that could bear the carriage in turn. And James understood, perhaps earlier than most of his contemporaries north of the Channel, that the future of both war and prestige lay in the marriage of the two. He brought gun founders into his service and set them to casting bombards and smaller ordnance in bronze, watching the process with what his court records suggest was genuine, unfeigned interest, rather than the polite attention of a monarch merely fulfilling an obligation of state. He is remembered to have visited the foundries himself, to have asked after the mixing of the metals, to have wanted, in the way of a man who liked to understand the things he commanded, some working knowledge of how a cannon came to be a cannon at all. The same curiosity turned, with time, toward the sea. Scotland in the last years of the 15th century was not a naval power in any sense that would have been recognized in Lisbon or Venice. Its coastline was long and its harbors many, but its ships were, for the most part, small. Trading vessels and fishing craft, a scattering of armed barks pressed into service when the Crown required them. Nothing that could be called a navy in the way that England, however modestly by later standards, could already claim one. James saw in this absence not merely a gap in his kingdom's defences, but an insult to its standing, a mark of smallness in an age when the great courts of Europe were beginning to measure one another's weight in hulls and guns as much as in land and lineage. He began, gradually, and then with mounting purpose, to acquire ships, some built in his own yards, some purchased abroad, a scattering of vessels that together formed the beginnings of something that could, with a measure of generosity, be called a royal fleet. The context in which this ambition took shape was one of old suspicion and careful manoeuvring. England lay to the south, and the border between the two kingdoms had for centuries been a line of raids and reprisals, of treaties made and broken, of a rivalry so old that it had become almost a condition of nature rather than a matter of policy. James had married Margaret Tudor, sister to the young Henry, who would in time become the eighth of that name to sit on the English throne, and the marriage had been framed in the hopeful language of diplomats as the seed of a lasting peace between the two crowns. But peace between Scotland and England had never been a simple or a durable thing, and beneath the courtesies of the marriage treaty ran currents of distrust that neither side fully set aside. France, meanwhile, offered Scotland an older and in some ways more comfortable alliance, the Old Alliance, as later generations would come to call it, a bond forged in shared suspicion of England. France was populous, wealthy, and skilled in the arts of war and shipbuilding alike, and its friendship gave Scotland both a counterweight to England's strength and a source of expertise that a smaller kingdom could draw upon. Within this triangle of alliance and rivalry, a fleet was not merely a matter of practical defense, it was a form of speech, a way for a small kingdom to say to its larger neighbors that it, too, belonged among the powers that mattered. A king who could put ships of real size and real menace to sea was a king who could not be dismissed lightly in the councils of Europe. Whatever the modesty of his kingdom's population, or the thinness of its treasury beside the riches of France or the growing wealth of England, James understood this arithmetic of prestige as well as any monarch of his age, and he pursued it with a seriousness that went beyond simple vanity. He wanted alliances that mattered, marriages that were respected, rather than merely tolerated, a voice in the affairs of the continent that Scotland's size alone would never have earned her. A navy and, above all, a flagship of unmistakable and undeniable size was one of the surest ways he knew to purchase that voice. It was within this convergence of personal fascination and national ambition that the idea of the Great Michael began to take shape. She was conceived, from her earliest mention in the records of the Crown, as something beyond an ordinary warship, not simply another vessel to add to a modest fleet, but a statement cast in oak and iron, a declaration that Scotland could build, arm and sail a ship to rival anything afloat in the waters of Europe. The ambition was audacious almost to the point of recklessness, for Scotland in these years was not a rich kingdom. Its revenues were a fraction of England's, smaller still beside France's, and its population was scattered across a landscape of hard farming and harder winters that left little surplus for grand projects of state. And yet James pressed forward, drawing on the resources of the Crown with a single-mindedness that suggests he understood precisely what he was asking of his kingdom, and judged the asking worth the cost. The human stakes of that judgment were not abstract. Every plank cut for such a hull was a tree that would not stand in a Scottish forest again. Every mark of silver spent on iron fittings and cordage was a mark drawn from a treasury that had other more ordinary demands upon it: soldiers to pay, roads to maintain, the countless small obligations of governing a kingdom that, for all its king's ambitions, remained a modest one in the eyes of the wider world. To build a ship on the scale James now envisioned was to ask the forests of Fife and the estates of the Crown to bend themselves toward a single vessel, to ask a kingdom of farmers and fishermen and small burghs to carry on their collective back the weight of a king's determination to be counted among the great powers of his age. It was, in its way, as much an act of faith as of policy, a wager that the prestige to be won would justify the sacrifice demanded, that a hull of sufficient size would speak loudly enough, for long enough, to be worth the forests it consumed and the silver it swallowed. Whether that wager was wise is a question the centuries have never quite settled, but there is no doubting the seriousness with which James pursued it, nor the scale of what he set in motion once his mind was made up. He was not a man given to half measures where his enthusiasms were engaged, and shipbuilding, by the final years of the 15th century, had become one of his deepest enthusiasms of all. Ship that would come to bear his father's name, for the great Michael was named. In the end, for the archangel long associated with the Stuart line, a fitting patron for a vessel meant to embody both martial power and royal piety, was not born of a single sudden decision, but of years of gathering appetite. Of a king, watching his gun founders at their furnaces and his shipwrights at their yards, and concluding, gradually, and then all at once, that Scotland was ready to attempt something the world had not yet seen from her shores. The surveyors went out before the shipwrights ever touched an adze to timber, moving quietly through the woodlands of Fife with the king's warrant in hand, and a purpose that the local foresters understood at once, even if they had never before seen it applied on such a scale. They walked the old stands of oak that had stood for generations, some of them planted or protected by monastic houses long before any Stuart sat on the throne, and they marked the great trunks with a practiced eye, looking not merely for height but for girth, for the particular curve of a limb that might become a knee or a futtock, for the straightness of grain that would resist the working of the sea for decades to come. It was slow work, and it required a kind of patience that modern eyes might find difficult to credit, a patience built into the very rhythm of forestry in that age. When a man might plant a tree, he would never live to fell, in the confidence that his grandchildren or the crown itself. The marking was done with an axe blaze cut into the bark, a pale wound against the grey-brown skin of the oak that told the fellers which trees belonged now to the king's great purpose. Fife's woods were rich by the standards of the day, home to oaks that had stood through the reigns of James's grandfather and great-grandfather. Oaks whose canopies had sheltered generations of swine, turned out to feed on the autumn mast. But even the richest of the Fife woods, the surveyors soon understood, could not alone answer the appetite of the ship the king had in mind. The word had gone out that this vessel was to dwarf anything before attempted in Scottish waters. And dwarfing required not simply many trees, but many of the very largest trees. The ones that took 100 years or more to reach the girth, required for a keel timber or a principal frame. And such giants did not grow in convenient abundance, even in the best managed of woodlands. So, the survey. Riders went out from the court to examine the royal forests beyond Fife, into Perthshire, along the fringes of the great Caledonian remnants that still, in that century, held something of the ancient wildwood's scale, and southward too, into woods held by abbeys and by noble families who might for a price or a favour be persuaded to yield their finest standing timber to the crown's shipwrights. The king's officers carried with them not just an eye for good wood, but an authority that could not easily be refused. For this was a royal project, blessed by the king's own enthusiasm, and a laird who hesitated to release his oaks might soon find himself reminded, gently or otherwise. Once marked, the trees came down under the axe, and the sound of that felling must have carried through those woods in a way that those who lived nearby would not soon forget. The ring of iron biting into old wood, a sound repeated for hour upon hour, day upon day, as teams of fellers worked their way through stand after stand of the king's chosen giants. The work was dangerous and exacting. A great oak did not fall conveniently, and the men who brought it down had to judge the lean of the trunk, the weight of the crown, the give of the ground beneath, lest the tree twist as it fell and crush a man beneath its bulk. When at last a giant came down, it came down with a sound that shook the ground and silenced the birds for a long moment afterward, and the woodland that had stood undisturbed for a century was, in the space of one long morning, made a little emptier. The smell of the work would have hung over those clearings for days. The sharp green scent of cut oak, resinous and faintly sweet, mixed with the churned earth where wagon wheels and dragging chains had torn the forest floor, and the sweat and leather smell of the draft animals brought in to haul the great trunks toward the coast. Oxen strained against their yokes, and where the ground was too soft or the timber too heavy for beasts alone, gangs of men added their strength to ropes and levers, inching the trunks by degrees toward tracks that led, eventually, down toward the Forth and the yard at New Haven, waiting to receive them. It was not swift work. A single mature oak, once felled, might occupy a team of men and animals for days, simply in the moving of it, and multiplied across the hundreds of great trees the ship was said to require. The labor of hauling alone represented an undertaking nearly as vast as the building of the hull itself. Yet even as the wagons rolled and the riverbanks began to fill with stacked and seasoning timber, it became clear to those overseeing the project that Scotland's forests, however rich, could not alone satisfy so hungry a design. The country's woodlands, though extensive by the standards of a smaller ship, had already been drawn upon for generations by the needs of building, of fuel, of the ordinary shipwrightery that kept Scotland's smaller vessels afloat, and the reserve of truly ancient, truly massive oaks, the sort needed for a keel of the length now being contemplated. For frames thick enough to bear the weight of the great guns planned for her decks, simply did not exist in sufficient quantity within the kingdom's own bounds. It was not a failure of ambition or of searching, it was a plain mathematical truth of forestry, that a hull of this scale demanded a volume and a quality of timber that no single stand, no single shire, indeed no single small kingdom's accumulated woodland could reliably provide. And so the king's agents turned their eyes across the sea toward France, whose forests were older and vaster than Scotland's own, and toward the Baltic ports, whose merchants had long supplied the shipyards of northern Europe with tall, straight timber cut from the great pine and oak forests of the eastern lands. Cargoes of foreign wood began to arrive at Scottish quays alongside the domestic harvest. Seasoned planking and long, straight spars purchased at considerable cost, a quiet acknowledgement, never much spoken of in the court's prouder accounts, that even a king's ambition required the cooperation of foreign woodlands to be fully realized. It was a strain not only on the treasury, but on something less easily measured, the sense, perhaps, that Scotland's own resources, however proudly marshalled, were not quite sufficient to the dream alone, that greatness of this particular kind required a kingdom to reach beyond its own borders and lean upon others. In the years and generations that followed, the memory of that felling, settled into something larger than the plain historical record could quite contain. Those who had watched whole hillsides stripped of their oldest trees, who had seen wagon after wagon roll down toward the coast, laden with timber that would never again stand rooted in Fife soil, passed down stories that grew, as such stories do. It was said, in time, that the ship had devoured an entire forest, that where once there had stood ancient wood, there was now only stump and bracken, and that the appetite of this single vessel had been great enough to leave a permanent scar upon the land itself. The truth, as the sparse surviving records suggest, was somewhat less absolute than the legend allowed, for the felling had drawn from many woods rather than consuming any single forest entire, and much of the timber, in the end, had come from beyond Scotland's shores altogether. But legends are not overly troubled by such qualifications, and the tale of the forest eaten whole by a hungry ship took root in local memory with the same tenacity that the old oaks themselves had once held to the Fife soil, becoming over the centuries less a record of forestry than a kind of folk shorthand, almost frightening scale of what King James intended to build. On the shore below Edinburgh, where the Firth of Forth narrows and deepens before opening toward the wider sea, a small settlement had been chosen to bear the weight of all this ambition made physical. New Haven was not, in those years, a place of any particular consequence, a scatter of fishing cottages, a shingle beach, waters sheltered enough to hold a hull steady while men worked upon her, deep enough, it was hoped, to eventually let her go. King James had looked at the coastline available to him and settled upon this quiet stretch, not for what it already was, but for what it could be made to become. A royal charter transformed the fishing hamlet into something closer to a purpose-built industrial town, though the word industrial belongs to a later century and would have meant little to the men who received the king's instructions. What they understood was simpler, that a harbour was to be built where none adequate had stood before, that sheds and yards and workshops were to rise along the foreshore, and that New Haven within the space of a few years would become the single most important shipbuilding site in the kingdom's history, however briefly that distinction might last. The scale of the undertaking demanded more than Scottish hands alone, however skilled those hands might have been in the construction of the galleys and barges that had long served the country's more modest maritime needs. No one in Scotland had built anything remotely like what the king now intended, and James, whatever his faults as a strategist, understood this limitation clearly enough to seek expertise beyond his own borders. He turned, as many ambitious European rulers turned in matters of shipbuilding during this period, to France, whose shipwrights had accumulated a reputation for constructing vessels of unusual size and sophistication. The man brought to New Haven to lead the project, variously recorded in the surviving documents as Jacques Terrell, or by similar spellings that reflect the uncertain transliteration common to Scottish clerks, unfamiliar with French names, arrived with a reputation for having overseen large-scale construction on the continent. Though the precise details of his prior career have not survived with any great clarity. What is certain is that he was granted considerable authority over the project, answerable directly to the Crown, and that his presence at New Haven signaled the seriousness with which King James regarded the entire enterprise. Around this French master, a workforce assembled that reflected the genuinely international character of the undertaking. Scottish carpenters and sawyers, accustomed to smaller vessels, but eager or simply obligated to learn the demands of a larger scale, worked alongside French shipwrights brought over specifically for their experience with hulls of unusual dimension. Records suggest that additional craftsmen arrived from Flanders and perhaps further afield, drawn by wages that the Scottish Crown, flush with the revenues of a relatively prosperous reign, could afford to offer. The mingling of languages across the saw pits and scaffolding at New Haven must have created its own particular texture of daily life. Orders passed in French and repeated in Scots. Technical terms borrowed and mangled and borrowed again. The ordinary friction and accommodation of men from different traditions learning to work as a single body toward a single enormous goal. No account describes this linguistic negotiation directly, but the logic of the situation makes it almost certain that such exchanges occurred daily, woven into the routine so thoroughly that no clerk thought it worth recording. The organization of the yard itself, insofar as it can be reconstructed from what evidence survives, followed the patterns common to major shipbuilding efforts of the period, scaled upward to match the ambition of the vessel it was meant to produce. Saw pits were dug and lined, deep trenches over which logs could be positioned and cut into planks and beams by pairs of sawyers working in a rhythm that must have become, over the months, almost a kind of exhausted music. One man standing above the log, one below in the pit, drawing the long saw back and forth through timber that resisted every stroke. Forges were raised nearby. Their fires kept burning to shape and reshape the iron fittings, the bolts and bands and fastenings that would hold so vast a hull together. For a ship of this size could not rely on wood and rope alone, but required iron in quantities that must have taxed the smiths considerably. Rope walks, those long, narrow tracks along which fibers were twisted into cable and cordage, stretched out from the yard's edges, producing rigging in lengths that ordinary vessels never required. Thick hawsers and lines meant to control sails and spars on a scale unfamiliar to most of the men laying the rope itself. Beyond the physical apparatus of construction lay the logistics required simply to keep such a workforce fed, housed and supplied across the years the project would consume. New Haven, so recently a fishing hamlet, had to expand almost overnight to accommodate craftsmen numbering in the hundreds, along with the laborers who supported them, carters bringing timber and provisions, coopers making barrels, bakers and brewers meeting the appetites of men engaged in heavy labor from dawn until the light failed. Crown's treasury records, fragmentary as they are, hint at the sheer administrative weight of the undertaking. Payments for lodging, for food, for the tools consumed and replaced, for the transportation of materials from distant quarries and forests to a coastline that had never before needed to absorb so much. It was, in every sense available to the language of the time, a national undertaking, drawing resources from across the kingdom and funneling them toward this single stretch of shore where a ship larger than any Scottish eyes had seen was slowly, patiently taking shape. The labor of actually raising the hull proceeded with a patience that modern habits of speed find difficult to fully imagine. The keel, once laid, formed the long spine along which everything else would be built. A single great timber or a series of timbers scarfed together with joints cut and fitted so precisely that the resulting beam could bear the enormous compressive forces a hull of this size would place upon it. From the keel, the ribs rose, the great curved timbers that would give the ship her shape, each one selected for a natural curve that matched as closely as the forests could provide the angle required at that particular point along the hull's length. This search for naturally curved timber, for trees whose growth had bent them into something close to the shape a shipwright needed, explains something of the desperate breadth of the search for wood described earlier. For a straight plank could be shaped by tools, but a rib required a curve already present in the grain. Port, curve that could take a tree a century or more to grow into. Raising each rib into position, securing it to the keel, and bracing it until the next could be added beside it was work that proceeded rib by rib, week by week, the hull's skeleton emerging slowly from what had been, only months before, standing forest. Men worked from scaffolding erected around the rising frame, hauling timbers into position with block and tackle, driving trenails and iron bolts through joints that needed to hold firm against the punishment of open water for years, or, if fortune allowed, for decades. The planking that would eventually cover this skeleton required its own patient process. Each plank steamed or soaked until pliable enough to bend against the hull's curve, then fastened and caulked with oakum and pitch to keep the sea where it belonged, on the outside of the hull rather than within it. It would be a mistake, and not one the surviving record encourages, to imagine this labor as anything other than ordinary men doing extraordinary work through the accumulation of ordinary days. No account describes heroics at New Haven. No individual craftsman emerges from the documents as a figure of particular renown beyond the French master who directed the whole. What the records imply instead, through their very silence on individual suffering or triumph, is a workforce that simply continued, day after day, through the difficulty of the labor and whatever discomforts of weather or injury or exhaustion that labor entailed. Men were hurt, certainly, in work of this kind, falls from scaffolding, crushed fingers, the countless small and large injuries that attended any major construction site, in an age before safety was considered a matter for regulation. Some portion of the workforce likely fell ill, given the crowded conditions and the unfamiliar climate that continental workers encountered on the Scottish coast. None of this appears in the surviving accounts with any specificity, and the absence itself deserves acknowledgement rather than invented detail. The human cost of building the Great Michael was real, however thoroughly history has declined to record its particulars, and the achievement that slowly rose along the New Haven shore was built, timber by timber, rib by rib, upon the ordinary endurance of craftsmen whose names, for the most part, the centuries have simply allowed to fall away. There came a day, unremarked in any surviving chronicle by fanfare or ceremony that history troubled itself to preserve, when the first great length of oak was laid along the prepared ground at New Haven and the keel of the ship began. It is worth pausing on this moment, brief as its record is, because a keel laying was not simply a construction step among many, but the true beginning of a vessel's life in the understanding of the age. Before the keel was set, there was only timber, iron, and intention. After it, there was a ship, however incomplete, however far from the water she would one day need to reach. The shipwrights who guided this moment would have known its weight, even if they left no account of their thoughts. A keel wrongly laid, out of true by even a small measure across so great a length, would haunt every rib and plank raised upon it, would announce itself in the ship's behavior at sea for as long as she sailed. The men bent to this work with the knowledge that they were setting not just a spine of oak into the ground, but a geometry that the entire vessel would be forced to obey. The scale of what they laid down deserves to be stated plainly, though always with the caution the sources demand. The keel of the Great Michael, according to the estimates historians have drawn from the fragments of record that survive, ran to something in the range of 180 feet, with an overall length nearer 240 feet once bow and stern were reckoned in, and a beam broad enough that near 40 feet is the figure most often repeated. These are not numbers that can be treated as certainties carved in stone. They descend to us through later Scottish chroniclers, through comparison with ships whose dimensions are better attested, through the slow work of naval historians attempting to reconcile a scattered handful of clues into something approaching confidence. But even allowing for the uncertainty, even granting every reasonable margin of doubt, the shape that begins to emerge is of a hull that had no obvious rival among the ships then sailing northern waters. To stand at the timber's edge and look along its length, if such a moment could somehow be recovered, would have been to look at a proposition that few shipyards in Europe had yet attempted to prove. It is important to understand what such a length meant in practical terms, beyond the satisfaction of simply being large. A keel of that scale required timber pieces scarfed and joined with a precision that smaller vessels never demanded, because the stresses traveling through so long a spine, once she was afloat and working in a seaway, would seek out every weakness with patient cruelty. The shipwrights understood this, even if they lacked the mathematical language a later age would use to describe it. Their knowledge was empirical, handed down through apprenticeship and failure, through vessels that had split their backs on lesser dimensions and taught hard lessons to those who built the next ones. Building at the scale the great Michael demanded was, in a very real sense, an extrapolation beyond safely tested ground. No one could say with confidence that a hull of this length, however carefully joined, would hold its shape under the working of wind and wave. The doubt was not idle. It was the ordinary sober doubt of craftsmen being asked to exceed what their training had prepared them to guarantee. This uncertainty extended beyond the question of whether the hull would hold together once built to the more immediate and in some ways more frightening question of whether it could be built and launched at all. A vessel of conventional size could be raised on a slipway with reasonable confidence that the accumulated experience of generations would see her safely into the water. But the great Michael's dimensions pressed against the very edges of what any northern European yard had accomplished. There were no confident precedents to consult, no elder shipwright who could say with certainty that a hull this size, once complete and laden with the weight of her own timbers and iron fittings, would slide from the shore into the Firth of Forth without some catastrophic failure of the ways beneath her, without grounding on unseen shallows, without simply proving too heavy for the human and mechanical means available to move her. This was not a fear confined to hindsight. It was, by the nature of the undertaking, a live and present anxiety among the men responsible for the work, one that would only intensify as the hull rose higher and the day of launching drew nearer, a difficulty the story must return to in its proper season. Behind this engineering uncertainty lay a financial one, quieter in the record, but no less real in its consequences for the kingdom that bore it. The royal accounts of James's treasurer, fragmentary as they are in the portions that survive, nonetheless offer glimpses of sums directed toward the New Haven works that suggest an effort straining the resources of a realm considerably smaller and poorer than its ambitions. Payments for timber, for iron, for the wages of foreign master shipwrights brought north at considerable expense for the provisioning of a workforce numbering in the hundreds across the years of construction, appear scattered through the surviving ledgers in amounts that, when historians have attempted to total them, arrive at figures difficult to reconcile with the ordinary revenues of the Scottish crown. Taxes were raised in some measure to support this undertaking, drawing coin from a population that would see little direct benefit from a warship built for purposes of prestige and continental rivalry as much as immediate defense, Resources that might have gone to other royal projects, to the ordinary business of governance, or to the more modest naval vessels a smaller kingdom might reasonably have found sufficient to its needs, were instead channeled toward this singular undertaking at New Haven. This is not to suggest that James lacked justification in his own mind for the expenditure, nor that his council was uniformly opposed to the drain on the treasury. The ship, after all, was meant to answer a genuine strategic and diplomatic calculation, the ambitions and anxieties already discussed in the account of the king who dreamed her into being. But it is worth pausing on the strain this created, because it establishes a theme that will echo through every later stage of the great Michael's story. The tension between what a king could envision and what a kingdom could sustain was present from the very moment the keel was laid, embedded in the wood itself, as surely as any structural stress the hull would later bear. A vessel of this scale was, in the most literal sense, a wager against the ordinary limits of Scottish resources, timber, and treasure, made in the confident hope that the strategic and symbolic returns would justify the outlay. Whether that wager paid what James imagined it would is a question the later chapters of this story must answer, but the strain itself, the friction between royal vision and practical imitation, begins here, at the keel, and never entirely departs the narrative that follows. There is something almost poignant, viewed from the distance of centuries, in imagining the shipwrights at this early stage, laying down oak that would eventually bear so much weight, so much expectation, so much of a kingdom's uncertain fortune. They worked, so far as the record allows us to say anything at all, with the ordinary professional focus of craftsmen concerned primarily with the immediate problems before them, the fit of one timber against another, the strength of a joint, the true line of a keel stretching further than most of them would have worked with before. The larger questions, whether the hull would hold, whether the launch would succeed, whether the kingdom's treasury could sustain the effort to completion, whether the ship would ever answer the strategic purpose James imagined for her, lay beyond their immediate concern, resting instead with the king, his treasurer. And the slow verdict of years not yet arrived. What they built, timber by timber, was the physical foundation of an ambition whose ultimate fate none of them could have foreseen. And it is this foundation, quite literally lying beneath everything that follows, from which the ship's whole story would eventually rise, plank by plank, toward a hull beyond anything Scotland, or perhaps Northern Europe, had confidently attempted before. What rose from that foundation did not resemble the ships the men of New Haven had spent their working lives building. Even the shipwrights who had raised the keel, who understood better than anyone the ordinary proportions of a warship, found themselves working now at a scale that seemed to defy the tools in their hands. The ribs, when they were finally set upon that long keel, curved outward, with a breadth that made the vessel appear, even in her infancy, less like a ship under construction than like some slow geological formation rising from the yard, the way a hillside might rise from a plain. Each rib was hewn from timber thick enough to have made an entire vessel in a lesser yard, and there were said to be more of them set closer together than tradition required, so that the skeleton of the ship, before a single plank had been laid across it, already carried the unmistakable suggestion of something built not merely to sail, but to endure. The planking that followed only deepened that impression. According to the accounts that survive, and they are accounts written by men who had every reason toward exaggeration, the walls of the Great Michael were raised from oak so thick that no gun of the age, fired from the deck of any rival ship, could be expected to pass through them. The figure, most often repeated, and repeated still by those who tell her story, holds that her sides measured some 10 feet through, oak set upon oak, layer bound to layer, until the hull itself became less a wall of wood than a rampart, a moving fortification that happened also to float. Whether the true measurement matched that figure precisely no surviving record can settle beyond dispute, and the historians who have studied her construction since have offered their own more cautious estimates, narrower than the old chroniclers claimed. Though even the most conservative of these still describe a hull thicker than anything else afloat in her waters. What no one disputes is the intention behind the timber, whatever its exact dimension. This was a ship built to be struck and to remain standing, built the way a castle is built, with walls meant to answer bombardment rather than merely to hold back the sea. To raise walls of that thickness required more than felled oak. It required iron in quantities that strained even a kingdom's foundries. For wood alone, however dense, however ancient, could not have held itself together at such a scale without the long bolts and spikes that ran through it, binding plank to rib and rib to keel, driven deep by smiths who worked, by all accounts, in numbers rarely gathered for a single vessel. The treasurer's accounts, fragmentary as they are, still preserve the shape of this effort in their entries for iron purchased, iron worked, iron carried to New Haven in loads that must have seemed to those hauling it endless. It is a strange thing to consider that a ship remembered chiefly for her timber was in truth a marriage of two elements, wood and iron together, each straining to keep the other in its place, and that the vastness of one required the vastness of the other in proportion neither material alone could have sustained. Above this reinforced hull, the ship rose through decks whose number itself became part of her legend. Later writers would speak of her as carrying several decks stacked one above the other, rising toward the sky in a manner more familiar to a coastal fortress than to any vessel then known in northern waters. And though the exact arrangement of these decks cannot now be reconstructed with full certainty, given how little of the original plan survives, the general impression left across the surviving accounts is consistent. A ship that climbed, deck above deck, further than the eye expected, so that a sailor standing upon her lowest deck and looking upward might have felt less that he stood aboard a ship than that he stood within the base of a tower that had, by some improbable working of shipwrights, been made to float. Along these decks ran the gun ports, cut through those same thick oak walls in numbers that dwarfed anything a Scottish yard, or indeed most yards in Christendom, had previously attempted. The old accounts speak of many dozens of guns, some placed low along her sides, others mounted higher upon decks built expressly to carry ordnance that in an earlier generation would have seemed impossible to raise so far above the waterline. Whether every figure recorded by later chroniclers can be trusted precisely is, as with so much of her story, a matter still argued by those who study her, some suggesting the numbers were inflated by later pride, others noting that even the more modest tallies still describe a ship whose broadside would have outweighed, gun for gun, most fleets she might conceivably have met. What can be said without much fear of overstatement is that no ship built in Scotland before her, and few built anywhere in Europe at that date, carried so much iron arranged for the purpose of war. It was this combination, the great thickness of oak, the sheer press of ordnance, the towering rise of deck upon deck, that made the ship, even unfinished, into something that demanded comparison. And such comparisons were not slow in coming. Contemporary observers and later historians, drawing on their testimony, would set her routinely beside the great ships of England, above all the vessel that King Henry's own yards had built, the Henry Grace Adieu, which was herself accounted a marvel in her own country and time. Yet even against that English giant, the great Michael was described, by more than one chronicler, as the larger vessel, broader in the beam, heavier in her sides, carrying more guns and requiring more men to work her. Later, scholarship has tempered some of these claims, noting that documentary comparison between the two ships is imperfect, resting on figures recorded by different hands for different purposes. and that some of the more dramatic assertions of Scottish chroniclers may have owed something to national pride as well as to measured fact. Still, even allowing for such caution, the surviving evidence leaves little doubt that the Great Michael belonged, at minimum, among the very largest ships then afloat in northern Europe, a vessel that any contemporary observer, English, French or otherwise, would have been obliged to notice, however, reluctantly. That reluctance, where it existed, sat alongside something closer to unease, and this too found its way into the record. For a ship raised to such a scale, in a kingdom whose resources were, by any honest reckoning, modest beside those of France or England, could not be regarded merely as an engineering triumph. She was also, inescapably, a kind of statement, and those who received that statement, whether at the English court or among the merchants of the Baltic and the Low Countries who depended upon safe passage through waters a ship like this, Scottish pride in the vessel is not hard to find in the surviving accounts, a pride bound up with the sense that a small northern kingdom had built something that even its wealthier neighbours had not attempted at such a scale, and this pride would only deepen as the ship neared completion. Yet, pride of that kind rarely travels alone, and the same records that preserve Scottish satisfaction also preserve, if more faintly, traces of a different reaction abroad, a wariness at what such a ship might portend, a recalculation, however quiet, of what a northern kingdom recently thought unlikely to trouble larger powers might now attempt with a floating fortress at her command. Whether that unease was justified by anything James intended, or whether it arose simply from the ship's improbable existence, is a question the surviving sources do not fully answer. What they do preserve, clearly enough, is the sense that this was a vessel whose size alone changed the calculations of those who heard of her, long before she had sailed a single mile or fired a single gun in earnest. She was, in this sense, already accomplishing part of what a king might have wished of her, simply by rising, deck by deck, wall by iron-bound wall, higher and broader than anything her neighbours had yet dared to build, resting still upon her stocks at New Haven, unlaunched, unproven at sea, and yet already in the minds of those who came to see her. A fact that could not easily be unmade. Upon that fact, the shipwrights and gun founders now began to lay a second kind of weight, less visible from the shore, but no less consequential. For a hull of such dimensions was not raised merely to be admired at anchor. She was built, at least in the telling that has come down across the centuries, to carry an arsenal such as no vessel in Scottish waters had carried before, and the accounts that survive, however uneven in their particulars, agree on this much, that the Great Michael was meant to bristle, port to port, with the iron voice of war. The number, most often repeated by those who wrote of her in the years and generations after her launch, is a great one. Some 300 guns, by the more generous reckonings, a figure that would have made her, had it been so, one of the most heavily armed vessels afloat anywhere in Europe of that age. Later historians have questioned this number, and rightly so, for such totals often grew in the retelling. The way a fish grows longer with each year, a fisherman describes it, and it is worth pausing here gently to say what can and cannot be said with confidence. The sources that survive are few, and none of them offer the kind of itemized inventory a modern scholar might wish for. A list of calibers and carriages set down in a clerk's steady hand. What survives instead are impressions, the recollections of those who saw her or heard of her, filtered through years of retelling before they were ever written down, and so the number 300 ought to be held loosely as a memory of scale rather than a ledger of fact. What is more soundly attested is the presence of heavy ordnance of real weight and reach, guns cast in Scotland's own foundries under the King's instruction, alongside pieces brought in from the continent, from France and from the Low Countries, where the casting of bronze and iron guns had by then become a settled craft. The king had spent years cultivating those foundries at home, drawing in gun founders from abroad to teach Scottish smiths the newer methods. And by the time the great Michael rose on her stocks, the kingdom possessed, for the first time in its history, the beginnings of an indigenous capacity to arm a fleet rather than simply borrow one. It is this context, more than any single tally of cannon, that lends credibility to the idea of a heavily armed ship. For a king who had already invested so much in the making of guns was unlikely to leave his greatest vessel lightly equipped. Among the pieces most often named in the old accounts are guns of a size that would have required teams of men merely to load and train them. Forward-facing pieces meant to smash a path through an enemy's rigging, or timbers before ever a boarding party could be called for, and smaller pieces meant for the close, chaotic work of clearing an enemy's deck should the two hulls ever come to lie alongside one another. Whatever the precise total, the intent is clear enough. This was to be a ship that fought at range as readily as she fought at close quarters, a floating battery as much as a floating fortress, her sides thickened with oak, precisely so that they might absorb a return of fire that would have broken a lesser hull apart. And yet a ship is not made ready for war by her guns alone, and here the record turns to a quieter, less thunderous kind of engineering, the raising of masts and the fitting of sails and the endless patient work of rigging a vessel large enough to need forests of rope where smaller ships needed coils. Accounts describe several masts rising from her deck, though again the exact number and their precise arrangement are not agreed upon by all who have studied her, some describing 4, others content to note simply that she carried more masts than was usual for a ship of her age. Each one stepped deep into the keel and braced by lines running fore and aft and out to either rail, a lattice of hemp holding aloft canvas enough to catch wind, sufficient to move so vast a hull at all. The sailmakers, whose names have not survived in the way the shipwrights' names have, must have faced a task nearly as daunting. The carpenters who raised her ribs, for canvas woven for an ordinary carrack, would have torn like paper under the strain of moving so great a weight. And so the sails themselves would have needed to be cut broader and stitched heavier. Panel upon panel joined by hand, the whole raised and lowered by crews trained to work in coordination, across yards that stood high above the deck, higher certainly than any mast a Scottish sailor of the previous generation would have climbed. The rigging alone, it is worth reflecting, represented a hidden cost nearly as great as the timber of the hull. For rope in that century was spun by hand from hemp grown and processed at real expense, and a ship of this size would have consumed cordage by the mile, cordage that had to be laid, tarred, coiled, and replaced as it wore. A continuous drain on resources that receipts and account books, where they survive at all, hint at without ever fully totaling. It was not only rope and canvas that the great Michael demanded, but men, and here the story turns towards something almost sobering when set against the modest scale of the kingdom that built her. The accounts speak of a crew numbering in the hundreds, sailors to work the sails and rigging, gunners to serve the ordnance, and soldiers besides drawn aboard to fight should she ever close with an enemy vessel, the whole complement said by some to have approached 1,000 souls when fully manned for war, a number that, whatever its precision, represented a meaningful fraction of the men Scotland could call upon for any single undertaking in that age. This was a kingdom whose entire population numbered perhaps 500,000 souls, scattered across farms and burgs and highland glens, and to draw 1,000 men into the service of a single ship was to draw deeply upon a well that was not, in truth, especially deep. It is worth sitting with this a moment, in the quiet way the old records themselves seem to invite, for a ship is only as capable as the hands aboard her, and a vessel of such size, demanding gunners trained to serve heavy ordnance, and sailors skilled enough to manage rigging on a scale unfamiliar to most of them, could not simply be crewed by pressing local fishermen into service for a season. Men had to be trained or brought in from abroad where such training already existed, and every soldier or gunner or skilled sailor drawn into her service was a man not available to garrison a border keep, or work a farm, or crew one of the kingdom's smaller, more numerous, and arguably more useful vessels. The Great Michael, in this light, was not merely an addition to Scotland's naval strength, but a concentration of it, a gathering of a kingdom's maritime and martial resources into a single hull, for better or for worse. And it is here that the quiet tension at the heart of the whole undertaking begins to show itself, a tension that later historians have returned to again and again. Whether a ship built so large, armed so heavily, and crewed so richly was in fact a practical instrument of war at all, or whether she had become, by the very scale of her ambition, something closer to a spectacle that happened to carry guns. A vessel so vast required deep water to maneuver, careful handling to bring her into action at all, and a harbour infrastructure that few ports in the region, Scottish or otherwise, could easily provide. She could not slip in and out of shallow anchorages the way smaller raiding vessels could. She could not be risked lightly, for her loss would have represented not merely a ship, but a portion of the kingdom's entire investment in naval power, concentrated and therefore fragile in a way that a fleet of smaller vessels spread across many hulls was not. Whether this tension was felt by the king himself in the years he watched her rise, the sources do not say, and it would be a kind of false certainty to claim otherwise. What can be said, calmly and without overreaching the evidence, is that the pattern of her later use, or rather her strikingly limited use, suggests that others came to feel this tension keenly enough, even if the king who commissioned her did not live to reckon with it himself. For now, though, she stood at New Haven, guns not yet run out, masts newly stepped, rigging newly rove, a ship whose full weight of iron and hemp and men had, by every account that survives, made her heavier and more formidably equipped than anything Scotland's coasts had ever held. Whatever uncertainty remains over the exact count of her guns or the precise cut of her sails, a hull raised on land is only half a ship. The other half of her existence waited in the water, and between the two lay a passage that had claimed vessels far smaller than the Great Michael before they ever tasted salt. Every shipwright at New Haven understood this. The keel had been laid, the ribs raised, the planking driven and caulked, but none of it meant a ship until the whole vast structure could be coaxed from the cradle of her building and set afloat without splitting her own spine under the strain of the attempt. It was, in its way, as delicate an undertaking as anything that had come before it. Delicate not because the work required a light touch, but because so much depended on hundreds of tons of timber moving as one, all at once, without hesitation. The problem was simple to state and brutally difficult to solve. A hull of this size, built up over years on a fixed foundation, had settled into the ground the way any great weight settles, timber compressing timber, joints seating themselves under the patient pressure of gravity. To launch her, that settled weight had to be lifted, however briefly, off its resting supports and transferred onto a system that could carry it smoothly and without shock down a graded slope and into the waiting water of the Firth. Any failure in that transfer, any beam that gave way unevenly, any cradle that shifted before its neighbour, any rope that parted under a load its fellows still held, could rack the hull, spring her seams, and undo years of labour in the space of a few dreadful seconds. The solution, as it had been for great ships before her, and would be for great ships after, lay in the ramps and cradles that New Haven shipwrights spent weeks preparing before the day of launch. Long timbers were laid down the slope of the yard toward the water, greased with tallow and soap in the manner ships had long been sent down to sea. The slick surface meant to reduce the friction that might otherwise stop her dead partway down the slope. Wedged and immovable, a disaster in slow motion rather than sudden collapse. Beneath the hull itself, cradles were built up in sections, great timber frames, shaped to bear her weight evenly along her length, distributing the load so that no single point of her hull carried more than its share. The building of these cradles was its own quiet labor, invisible in the record, but not in the imagination. Men fitting timber to timber, testing joints, driving wedges, all in service of a structure that would exist for perhaps an hour and would either succeed completely or fail in a way that could not be undone. Manpower, too, had to be assembled in quantities that reflected the scale of the task. Accounts from other great launches of the period, and the general practice of the age, suggest that ropes were run to capstans and to teams of men and oxen stationed to haul in coordinated pulls, timed and directed by shouted commands, the whole effort choreographed as carefully as anything in the yard had been. The exact numbers gathered at New Haven for the Great Michael's launch do not survive in any account precise enough to quote with confidence, but the scale of the ship makes plain that this could not have been a modest undertaking. Where smaller vessels might be launched by a few dozen men and a handful of ropes, a hull of this size would have demanded a small army of labor drawn from the yard itself and likely from the surrounding country, men called in for a single day's extraordinary effort whose names the records do not preserve, but whose combined strength was, for a few tense hours, all that stood between the ship and disaster. There would have been crowds, too, though here again the record offers less than the imagination wants. A ship of this reputation, built at royal command and already spoken of in the yards and taverns of the coast as something unprecedented, would not have been launched in privacy, but of her size had travelled, as word of such things always does, and it is reasonable to think that those who could make the journey to New Haven did so, drawn by curiosity, by pride, by the simple desire to say afterward that they had seen it. Fishermen would have paused their nets. Merchants and clerks would have found reasons to be near the shore that day. Perhaps the king himself was present, or perhaps he received word after the fact at Edinburgh. The sources are not precise enough to say with certainty which is true, but either way, the launch of the Great Michael was not merely a technical operation carried out by shipwrights for shipwrights. It was an event that belonged, in some measure, to the kingdom that had paid for her. The tension of that day, if we allow ourselves to imagine it as those present must have felt it, would have built slowly, rather than arriving all at once. There is a particular quality to the waiting that precedes a launch, a stretch of time in which everything has been prepared and nothing yet has happened. When the ropes are taut and the cradles are set, and the only thing left is the order to begin. In that stretch, every eye would have gone to the timbers of the ramp, to the rope stretched from capstan to hull, searching for any sign of strain that might presage failure, a rope beginning to fray, a beam beginning to bow, a shift in the ship's stillness that suggested she was not resting quite as evenly as she had a moment before. Shipwrights who had spent years building her would have watched with a particular dread, knowing better than anyone present exactly how much could go wrong and exactly how little warning of failing timber gives before it gives entirely. And then, whether by the pull of ropes and the push of levers, or by some combination of both, the great weight of her began to move. It is here that the record, thin as it is on particulars, allows us at least the certainty of the outcome. She went down the ways and into the water of the Firth, and she did not break. Whatever strain the timbers bore, whatever moment of held breath passed through the crowd as her bulk shifted from stillness into motion, the structure built to carry her held, and the ship that had taken years to raise on land found her true element in what must have been a matter of minutes. There is no surviving account rich enough to tell us precisely how the moment looked, whether she entered the water with a great surge of displaced sea rising up her sides, whether a cheer went up from the assembled crowd, whether the shipwrights who had labored over her allowed themselves some visible relief after months of guarded anxiety. What can be said with more confidence is what the moment meant. A ship of this size, successfully launched, was proof that the ambition behind her was not folly. It was proof that the calculations of her builders had been sound, that the timber gathered from across the kingdom and beyond, it had been shaped correctly, that the years of labor at New Haven had produced something that could exist in the world rather than remain a magnificent skeleton on land. For James, whatever pride or relief he felt at the news, the moment must have carried a particular satisfaction, not merely that a great ship existed, but that it existed because he had willed it, and that the will of a Scottish king had produced something no Scottish king had produced before. It is worth pausing on the quiet weight of that achievement, stripped of spectacle. No trumpets are recorded, no elaborate ceremony described in surviving accounts, though ceremony of some kind seems likely given the ship's importance. What we can say with confidence is more modest and, in its way, more affecting. A hull, larger than any before it, in that kingdom's history had been built by hand, moved by rope and muscle and grease, and set into salt water without breaking apart in the attempt. For those who had spent years bent over her timbers, and for those who had merely come to watch, that alone would have been enough to justify the gathering. The great Michael floated. Whatever trials awaited her at sea, whatever fate history had in store for a ship built at such cost and against such odds, she had passed the first and most unforgiving test a ship of her size could face, and she had passed it whole. She floated, and then she sailed, and the sailing itself became a kind of proclamation, carried not in words, but in the simple fact of her passage along the coasts of a kingdom that had never before produced anything so vast to send out upon the water. In the months that followed her launch, the great Michael did not vanish into obscurity to perform some quiet, practical duty. She moved along the Forth and out into the wider waters beyond it, and wherever she went, she was seen, and being seen was very often the whole of her purpose. A ship of her size could not slip past unnoticed, even had her captains wished it, and there is little indication that discretion was ever the intention. She was built to be observed, to be reported upon, to travel from harbour to harbour as a kind of moving fact that other kingdoms would be forced to reckon with. And in this she succeeded, long before she ever came close to a battle. Her early service consisted largely of patrols along Scotland's own waters, brief excursions that served less to repel any immediate threat than to remind those living along the coast and those watching from further off that the kingdom now possessed something unprecedented. She appeared at gatherings and ceremonies, anchored where crowds could take her measure, her decks crowded with men whose numbers alone spoke to the resources a king had been willing to commit to her existence. Accounts from the period, sparse as they are, describe her presence at such moments less as a martial display than a spectacle, a vessel meant to be walked around and marveled at from the shore, her masts rising higher than anything else afloat in those waters. Her hull, a dark wall of oak that dwarfed every fishing boat and merchant vessel that came near her. She was, in this sense, less a weapon deployed than a message delivered, and the message was aimed as much at London and Paris as at any Scottish audience gathered on the quay. News of her did not stay contained within Scotland's borders for long. Ships of her described size were rare enough events that word of her existence travelled quickly along the trading routes and diplomatic channels that connected the courts of Northern Europe, carried by merchants, by envoys, by the ordinary traffic of information that moved between kingdoms, even when no formal correspondence addressed the matter directly. What is recorded of the English response suggests a mixture of curiosity and unease, an acknowledgement that the King of Scots had produced something for which there was no immediate answer in an English shipyard. Henry VIII, coming to his own throne only a handful of years after the Great Michael's launch, is known to have pursued his own ambitions in shipbuilding with a seriousness that historians have long connected, at least in part, to the example set by his northern neighbour. Whether the Great Michael was the sole spur behind England's later efforts to build larger ships of her own, or merely one factor among several, the timing invites the connection, and the anxiety it suggests was real enough, even if its exact proportions cannot now be measured with precision. The French court, for its part, watched Scotland's shipbuilding ambitions through the lens of an alliance that had bound the two kingdoms together for generations. An alliance that made the Great Michael less a threat than a curious asset, a resource whose existence might someday serve French interests as readily as Scottish ones. Diplomatic correspondence, from the period where it survives, tends to treat the ship as a matter of interest rather than alarm, an object of discussion at court, more for its scale than for any specific strategic calculation. But even friendly courts took note of what such a vessel implied about the ambitions of the king who had commissioned her, and about the resources a smaller kingdom had proven willing to expend in pursuit of a single, extraordinary undertaking. A ship of that size, built by a nation whose population and treasury were modest by the standards of its larger neighbours, was itself a kind of argument, made not in speeches or treaties, but in oak and iron, and the visible fact of her floating. This was, perhaps, the truest purpose the Great Michael ever served. She was an instrument of prestige, as much as an instrument of war, built to project a claim about Scotland's place among the kingdoms of Europe that no amount of diplomatic language could have made so vividly. A monarch who could summon the forests of his realm, gather shipwrights from abroad, and produce a vessel larger than anything built in England or France, was a monarch whose court could not be dismissed as provincial or peripheral. The ship's guns, however many she truly carried, mattered less in this calculation than her sheer visible mass, the impression she created simply by existing, riding at anchor in the Forth, where ambassadors and merchants alike could carry word of her back to their own courts. In an age when royal reputation was built as much through spectacle as through policy, the Great Michael functioned as a floating assertion of standing, a wooden argument for a kingdom's ambitions that required no translation. Yet for all the anxiety and admiration she provoked abroad, the Great Michael's practical service revealed limitations that no amount of prestige could entirely conceal. The very harbours of Scotland, which had struggled to accommodate her construction and her launch, proved similarly reluctant to accommodate her ongoing presence. Few ports along the coast possessed water deep enough to shelter a hull of her draft comfortably, and the logistics of provisioning and maintaining a vessel of such size strained resources that a kingdom of Scotland's means could ill afford to sustain indefinitely. The costs that had gone into her construction, staggering by any account that survives, did not end with her launch. A ship so large required a crew numbering in the hundreds, supplies in proportion to her size, and constant attention to the upkeep of timbers and rigging that had been assembled at the very edge of what contemporary shipbuilding could achieve. Each of these ongoing expenses fell upon a treasury that had already been stretched thin by the original undertaking, and there is little in the surviving record to suggest that James IV's kingdom possessed the deeper resources that a vessel of this scale would have required to remain a permanent, active instrument of naval power. Nor did Scotland possess, at the time of her launch, a fleet substantial enough to make full use of her. The Great Michael was, in effect, a giant without an army of lesser ships to support her in any sustained campaign. A single vessel, however magnificent, could not by itself control the seas around a kingdom's coasts, could not blockade an enemy's harbours or escort merchant convoys across long distances without smaller, more numerous ships to work alongside her. Scotland's navy at the time consisted of a modest number of vessels, none approaching her scale, and the gap between the Great Michael's individual grandeur and the kingdom's collective naval capacity remained wide throughout her years of service. She was, in this sense, a flagship without a fleet worthy of the name, a singular achievement that outpaced the infrastructure meant to support it. This was the paradox at the heart of her existence, one that would only grow more evident as the years passed. She was magnificent in wood and iron, unmatched in scale by anything else afloat in those northern waters, and yet uncertain in her true naval purpose beyond the demonstration of her own existence." End quote. A ship built at such cost, requiring such enormous ongoing expense to maintain, needed a mission commensurate with her scale if she was ever to justify the resources poured into her, and no such mission ever quite materialized in the years immediately following her launch. She patrolled, she appeared, she was seen and reported upon by wary courts across the Channel and the North Sea. But she was never called upon to prove herself in the one arena that might have settled the question of her worth beyond argument: a great engagement at sea against a rival power's fleet. Whether this was fortunate or unfortunate for the ship herself, whether a genuine test of arms would have vindicated her design or exposed weaknesses that ceremony and patrol could conceal, remains one of the many questions the surviving record cannot answer. For the moment, though, in those early years after her launch, she served the purpose her king had perhaps most deeply intended all along. Gliding along the coasts of a kingdom eager to be taken seriously by its larger neighbours, carrying in her very silhouette an argument no ambassador could have delivered so persuasively. Wary eyes watched her from English ports and French quaysides alike, and whatever calculations those eyes made about Scotland's ambitions, the ship herself continued her slow, deliberate progress along the waters that had built her, waiting, as ships so often do, for the moment when history would finally ask something more of her than simply to be seen. That moment arrived sooner than anyone in Scotland might have wished, though its coming had been visible for years to those who read the shifting alliances of Europe with any care. By the summer of 1513, the old entanglements of the continent had drawn Scotland and England once more toward the collision that generations of treaties and marriages had tried and failed to prevent. James IV had bound himself by the old alliance to the cause of France, and when Henry VIII of England led an army across the Channel to press his own ambitions there, the French king called upon Scotland to honour its old promise and open a second front in the north. James, a monarch who had spent more than a decade building the instruments of a modern state, the guns, the fortifications, the fleet crowned by the great Michael herself, now faced the test. He mustered an army said by the chroniclers to be the largest Scotland had ever put into the field, and in August of that year he crossed the border into England, carrying with him not only soldiers and cannon, but the full weight of a reign's ambition. What role the great Michael played in the months that followed remains one of the quieter uncertainties in her story, and the sources that survive do not agree easily on the answer. Some accounts suggest she sailed as part of a Scottish naval effort that summer, perhaps supporting operations along the coast or escorting other vessels engaged in the wider conflict with England at sea, where Scottish and English ships had already traded losses in the months before the land campaign began. Other historians read the fragmentary records more cautiously, noting that the great ship's exact movements during 1513 are difficult to reconstruct with confidence, and that her documented presence in the years just before and after the campaign is thinner than a vessel of her fame might lead one to expect. What can be said is that the war on land, not the war at sea, would decide the fate of Scotland that year, and that whatever the great Michael's precise contribution to the naval side of the conflict, she was not present on the field where the outcome was ultimately determined. James IV's campaign was, in its essence, an army's war, fought with pikes and cannon on Scottish soil-turned battlefield, and the great ship that had consumed a forest and emptied a treasury waited elsewhere, her guns silent. The army that James led south was formidable by the standards of the age, equipped with artillery cast in the same royal foundries that had helped arm the great Michael, and organized with the same appetite for continental methods that had shaped so much of his reign. He crossed into Northumberland, took several English strongholds, and positioned his forces on Flodden Edge, a ridge that offered strong ground and a commanding view of the country below. The Earl of Surrey, commanding the English response, maneuvered his army into a position that forced James to abandon the advantage of his hilltop and descend to meet the English on less favorable terrain. What followed, on the 9th of September, was a battle that would be remembered in Scotland for centuries as among the darkest days in the nation's history. The accounts describe a clash of pikes and bills in driving rain and failing light, the Scottish formations breaking against English resistance in the boggy ground below the ridge, and a slaughter that fell with particular cruelty upon the kingdom's nobility, who had marched to war alongside their king in numbers that left entire noble houses without an heir by nightfall. James IV himself died on the field, the last king of Scotland to fall in battle, his body reportedly found among the thickest of the fighting, close enough to the English lines that some accounts describe him as having very nearly reached the enemy commander before he was cut down. The chroniclers who recorded the battle in the years that followed dwelt at length on the scale of the loss, not merely the king but earls, bishops and lords, in numbers that left the governance of Scotland in the hands of a regency for an infant heir, James V, not yet 2 years old at the time of his father's death. It is worth pausing here, in the same unhurried way this story has paused before, to consider what this single afternoon meant for the vision that had built the great Michael in the first place. Every forest felled, every foreign shipwright summoned, every gun cast and hung from her ports had been an expression of one king's belief that Scotland could stand as an equal among the maritime and military powers of Europe. That belief had a name and a face, and on the 9th of September that face was gone, along with a great portion of the class of men who might have carried his ambitions forward. The chaos that followed Flodden was not the chaos of a single dramatic collapse, but the slower, grinding disorder of a kingdom suddenly deprived of its guiding will. An infant king cannot commission ships or direct fleets, and the regency councils that governed in his name were consumed in the years immediately after the battle with the far more pressing business of survival, securing the borders against opportunistic English incursion, managing the rival ambitions of noble factions who saw in the young king's minority a chance to advance their own houses, and simply holding together a government that had lost, in a single afternoon, an unusually large proportion of its experienced leadership. The historians who have studied this period describe the years following Flodden as ones of retrenchment rather than expansion, in which the state's resources were directed towards stability rather than prestige, and in which grand maritime ambitions of the kind James IV had pursued found little support among regents whose attention was fixed on holding the kingdom together. For a fleet built on the premise of royal ambition, this was a slow but unmistakable turning point. The great Michael had never been a vessel that could sustain herself on the ordinary business of trade or fishing. He had been built for a purpose that belonged entirely to the vision of the king who commissioned her, and with that king gone, the fleet he had assembled found itself increasingly without a clear function, or, more practically, without the continued flow of royal funds that a ship of her size demanded simply to remain seaworthy. The maintenance of a vessel like the Great Michael was not a modest undertaking. The rigging required constant attention. The timbers needed regular care against rot and the corrosive effects of salt water, and a crew of the size such a ship demanded could not be kept indefinitely without purpose or pay. A regency government occupied with border defense and factional politics had little appetite, and perhaps little capacity, to continue underwriting a flagship whose primary value had always been symbolic rather than strategic. It is in this quiet aftermath, rather than in any single dramatic event, that the story of the Great Michael takes its most consequential turn. The ship that had been built to project the strength of a kingdom now found herself outliving the political conditions that had justified her existence. A magnificent vessel adrift in a sense, within a court that could no longer afford the dream she represented. Scotland after Flodden was a smaller, wearier nation, its ambitions curtailed not by any failure of will, but by the brutal arithmetic of loss. A king dead, a nobility diminished, an infant heir, and a treasury already strained by years of shipbuilding. The forest that had been felled to build her remained felled. The debts incurred in her construction remained on the ledgers, but the singular royal ambition that had justified those sacrifices had gone silent with the king who held it. What remained was the practical question of what a struggling regency should do with so vast and so expensive a ship, a question that would, in the years that followed, find its answer not in continued Scottish service, but in a transaction that would carry the Great Michael away from the waters that had built her, into the hands of the very kingdom whose alliance had drawn Scotland into the war that ended her purpose in the first place. The regency that governed Scotland in the aftermath of Flodden inherited a treasury already strained thin by war, and among the many burdens pressed upon it, the Great Michael sat heaviest of all. She required, even at rest, a small army of caretakers, men to tend her rigging against rot, men to pump her bilges, men to watch her hull for the slow damages that came simply from existing, from swelling and drying. A ship of her size did not become cheaper once she stopped sailing. If anything, the accounts suggest the opposite. Idle, she consumed money with nothing to show for it but her own persistence. A great wooden weight anchored in the Forth, waiting for a purpose that no longer existed. The king who had wanted her was gone. The war she had been built to help wage was lost, and lost badly, in a single terrible afternoon that had taken not only James, but a great portion of the nobility who might otherwise have argued for her continued upkeep. What remained in Edinburgh was a council of regents, a young king barely past infancy, and ledgers that did not balance. It was, in this atmosphere, some accounts suggest, within a year or so of Flodden itself, that the decision was made, quietly, without the pageantry that had once attended every stage of the ship's life, to sell her. There is no surviving record of a single dramatic council session in which the fate of the Great Michael was debated aloud, no transcribed speech in her defense or in favor of her sale. What survives instead are the bare bones of a transaction, correspondence, brief mentions in treasury accounts, the kind of paperwork that outlives ceremony precisely because it was never meant to be remembered. The ship that had taken years of a kingdom's timber and treasure to build was disposed of in the end, through the same quiet administrative channels that handled the sale of grain stores or the settling of unpaid wages. There was no launch day crowd for this moment. There were no clergy to bless the transfer, no cannon fired in salute. Ship that had once seemed to embody the ambitions of an entire nation changed hands the way one might sell off livestock or surplus cloth, because a nation in difficulty had need of the money and no further need of the ship. The buyer was France, the very kingdom whose alliance, sealed through the old bonds of the old alliance, had drawn James into the war against England that ended at Flodden. There is a symmetry here that the surviving records do not comment upon directly, but which the shape of events makes hard to ignore. Scotland had built the Great Michael, at least in part, as a demonstration of what that alliance meant. A partner worth having, a kingdom capable of standing alongside France as more than a junior partner in the old rivalry with England. She had been intended, among her other purposes, as proof of Scottish seriousness. A vessel that could sail south in support of French interests if called upon, a floating assurance that the alliance carried real weight. Instead, in the years following the disaster that the alliance had helped bring about, she passed into French hands, not as an ally's contribution to a shared cause, but as a piece of property, sold for coin to help a broken treasury recover. The price recorded in the surviving accounts is modest against what the ship had cost to build, a fraction of the sums that had gone into her timber, her guns, her ironwork, her years of labor. Historians who have examined the figures note the disproportion with a kind of quiet resignation. This was never going to be a transaction that recovered the investment. A ship built as an act of royal ambition, financed without much regard for return, could not be expected to sell for anything approaching what she had consumed. She had never been meant to earn her keep in the ordinary sense. She had been meant to exist, to be seen, to project. Once the crown that wanted her seen was gone, her market value collapsed to something much closer to the value of her materials and her usefulness as a hull rather than as a symbol. The sums that survive in the records are the kind of figures that appear only once in a single ledger entry, without commentary, a price, a date, a brief note of the vessel's transfer, and nothing more. No chronicler thought to dwell on it. The moment that ended the Great Michael's Scottish life was not commemorated. It was filed. There is something in this quiet, transactional close that marks a real shift in how the ship's story must be told. For the length of her building and her brief service, the Great Michael belonged to the register of national pride. She was spoken of, when she was spoken of at all, in the surviving sources, in terms of scale and wonder, a thing built to be marveled at. Once she passed to France, she drops almost entirely out of that register. She becomes, in what few records survive from her later years, a ship among ships in someone else's fleet. Noted in dockyard inventories, mentioned in passing where French naval administration required some account of vessels under royal charge, but no longer the subject of wonder. The change is not simply one of ownership. It is a change in the kind of story a ship can have. A vessel built to be the largest and most singular thing afloat, once absorbed into a foreign navy already possessed of its own fleet and its own priorities, could not retain that singularity. She became instead one asset among many, valued by the French crown for whatever practical use she might still offer, rather than for the symbolic weight she had once carried at home. What that practical use amounted to is not entirely clear from the sources that survive. There are suggestions that she served for some years in French waters, based far from the Firth of Forth that had built her, in dockyards along the northern coast, where the French crown maintained its naval interests. The details are thin, a mention here, an inventory entry there, and historians have had to reconstruct her later service from fragments rather than from any continuous record. She does not appear to have distinguished herself in French hands in any way that left a strong trace in the chronicles. No great battle fought under a new flag, no famous voyage recorded by French sources, with anything like the attention Scottish writers had once given her construction. She simply continues, quietly, in the background of another kingdom's naval affairs, a large and expensive vessel that required the same constant care she had required in Scotland, now paid for by a different treasury. There is an emotional undertone to this stretch of her story that is easy to miss if one reads only for facts, but which becomes clear enough once the shape of the whole is considered. a ship raised as a monument to one kingdom's ambition, built from forests that a nation had stripped bare in the name of royal vision, financed at a cost that strained the treasury for years, sailed once with pageantry and pride along her own coastline, had become, within a handful of years, a line item in the accounts of another crown, entirely. The forests of Fife had not been felled, so that France might have an extra hull in its dockyards. The shipwrights at New Haven had not spent years shaping her timbers so that she might end her working life as an unremarkable vessel, maintained out of obligation in ports she had never been built to know. And yet this was, in the plainest reading of the surviving record, exactly what happened. The grandest ship Scotland had ever built passed out of Scottish hands within a year or two of the disaster that ended the ambitions she had been built to serve. And she passed, not through conquest or capture, not through any dramatic reversal that might have given her later story its own kind of grandeur, driven by ordinary need, absorbing an extraordinary vessel into the quiet, unremarkable machinery of another kingdom's fleet. In the accounts that survive from the French side of this transaction, the Great Michael appears not as a wonder, but as an asset, a hull to be logged, valued, and put to use, one vessel among many in a navy that had its own priorities. The ship that had drained a kingdom's forests, that had carried the hopes of a court eager to stand among the great powers of the age, entered French service as little more than a large and useful thing, and it is in this quiet demotion, more than in any single dramatic event, that her decline truly begins. The pattern is a familiar one to anyone who has followed the long history of great ships built for symbolic purpose. A vessel raised to declare a kingdom's ambition carries meaning only so long as someone in power continues to invest that meaning in her. Once she passes to hands, with no memory of the forests felled to build her, no memory of the king who walked her decks and the queens and ambassadors who marveled at her guns, she becomes simply a ship, large, certainly, and useful for that largeness, but no longer a statement. The French crown had not commissioned her, had not staked its pride on her construction, and felt none of the reverence that had attended her raising at New Haven. To the officials who now accounted for her in their ledgers, she was tonnage and cargo capacity, timber and iron already paid for by another nation's exhausted treasury. And this shift in perception, quiet, administrative, almost bureaucratic, did more to end her significance. The surviving fragments of record suggest that the Great Michael was not immediately broken up or abandoned upon her sail, and it would be wrong to imagine her passing from Scottish pride to French scrapyard in a single stroke. Ships of her size represented too great an investment, even second-hand, to be discarded lightly, and for some period the sources are not precise on how long, and estimates offered by later historians vary. She appears to have remained in active or semi-active service, employed in the ordinary business of a Renaissance navy. This meant transport, patrol, the unglamorous labor of moving men and supplies along coasts and between ports, work entirely beneath the ambitions that had first justified her construction. A ship built to project the power of a kingdom now performed the duties of a workhorse, and there is a particular quiet sorrow in this kind of decline, one that asks for no dramatic language because the facts themselves carry all the weight required. She did not sink in battle. She did not burn in some final memorable catastrophe that later chroniclers could seize upon and shape into legend. She simply continued, diminished, doing lesser work for a crown that had not built her and did not need her the way Scotland once believed the world would need her. It is worth pausing on what this kind of use does to a vessel of such construction. The Great Michael had been built with attention to permanence. Thick oak sides, a scale of framing meant to withstand the guns of any rival, a design intended less for speed or grace than for endurance and overwhelming presence. But endurance in a ship is not the same as immortality, and every additional voyage, every season spent afloat, without the careful maintenance that a flagship commands, drew down the reserves of soundness built into her by the shipwrights of New Haven. Timber that had been felled with such difficulty across the forests of Fife and Falkland, hauled and shaped, and joined by craftsmen who understood they were building something meant to last generations, now absorbed the ordinary wear of unglamorous labor, the slow intake of water through strained seams. The rot that finds its way into any hull left too long without the attention that grandeur once guaranteed. There is a particular kind of neglect that overtakes great ships once their symbolic purpose fades, and it rarely arrives as a single decision. No French official, so far as the record shows, ever declared that the great Michael should be allowed to decay. Instead, the neglect accumulates through 1,000 smaller choices. The repair postponed because funds were needed elsewhere, the inspection deferred because no pressing occasion demanded the ship look her best, the crew assigned in numbers sufficient for routine duty but insufficient for the constant vigilance a vessel of her size and age required. Each of these choices, taken alone, seems reasonable enough. Taken together, across years, they describe the slow abandonment of a hull that had once commanded the attention of kings. The sources that might tell us precisely when and how the great Michael met her final end are frustratingly thin, and honest history must acknowledge this, rather than invent a tidy conclusion where none exists. Some later accounts suggest she was eventually broken up in a French harbour, her timbers stripped for whatever value remained in them, iron fittings salvaged, sound wood repurposed into lesser vessels or harbour structures, the great oak sides that had once been marvelled at reduced to raw material for uses far removed from the grandeur of her launching. Other accounts, less certain, suggest a slower dissolution, a gradual settling into disrepair until she was no longer seaworthy at all, left to rot at her moorings until nothing remained worth recording. The disagreement between these versions is itself telling. A ship that mattered, that still carried weight in the eyes of those who kept the records of the age, would have had her ending documented with the same care that attended her launching. The absence of such care, the vagueness that surrounds her final years, confirms in its own quiet way just how far she had fallen from the vessel that once drained a kingdom's forests and dominated the waters of the Forth. There is something almost unbearably ordinary about this ending, and it is worth sitting with that ordinariness rather than smoothing it into something more dramatic than the record allows. The great Michael was not lost in a storm that might later be recounted with awe. She did not go down fighting some superior force in a battle that would give later generations a stirring image to remember her by. She simply wore out, far from the country that built her, absorbed into a foreign navy's routine business, until she ceased to be useful, and then ceased to be seaworthy, and then, in all likelihood, ceased to be anything more than timber for other purposes. The forests of Fife had been stripped to raise her. The treasury of Scotland had been strained to fit her with guns and rigging beyond anything the kingdom had attempted before. And at the end of all that effort, all that ambition, all that expense of wood and labour and royal will, she came apart quietly in a harbour that had never asked for her and did not mourn her passing. This quiet anticlimax carries its own kind of meaning, one that a more dramatic ending would have obscured. The great Michael's story asks us to consider what happens when the will that sustains a great work is removed from it. She had been built not merely from timber and iron, but from the concentrated intention of a king who wanted Scotland to stand among the great naval powers of Europe. And so long as that intention held, so long as James remained alive, the court around him continued to invest her with meaning. The moment that intention passed, first through the king's death at Flodden, Then, through the sale that removed her from Scottish hands entirely, she became merely a very large, very old ship, subject to all the same forces of decay and neglect that attend any vessel once no one remains invested enough to protect her from them. It is a pattern that repeats across the long history of ambitious ships, though few examples state it as plainly as this one. A hull, however vast, however carefully built, cannot outlast the purpose that called it into being. Wood rots, whether or not a kingdom's pride depends upon it. Iron rusts, whether or not ambassadors once marvelled at the guns it formed. The Great Michael's timbers, felled with such labour from forests that would take generations to recover, proved in the end no more permanent than the political will that had ordered their harvest. Raised to declare that Scotland could build anything England could build and more besides, and in her slow, undocumented, almost anonymous ending in a foreign harbour, she offered a different and quieter lesson, that greatness sustained by will alone fades exactly as quickly as that will does. How much royal treasure had gone into building something that was meant, however briefly, to seem as though it might last forever? What survives of the Great Michael, then, is not the ship herself, but the trace of her passage through other people's paperwork. A scattering of entries in treasurers' accounts, a handful of references in French naval correspondence, and a body of later Scottish chronicle writing that remembered her with more affection than precision. Taken together, these sources form less a portrait than a mosaic with half its tiles missing. And historians who have tried to reconstruct her true dimensions, her armament, her final years have had to work always with the uneasy knowledge that the pieces they hold may never have belonged to quite the same picture in the first place. The royal accounts are the closest thing to a contemporary record, and even they were never meant to describe a ship for the benefit of later centuries. They were kept to track expenditure. So many merks paid to the wrights, so much for pitch and cordage and the wages of men who dragged timber down to New Haven, and a ledger of costs, however faithfully kept, does not translate cleanly into a ledger of dimensions. The clerks who recorded these payments had no reason to note the ship's length along the keel or her beam at the widest strake, because such details meant nothing to the business of paying a shipwright his fee. What they left behind, instead, is an economic silhouette of the Great Michael, the shape of the money that built her, rather than the shape of the hull that money bought. From these figures, historians can infer scale, can compare her cost against other great construction projects of James's reign, and conclude that no ship built in Scotland before or for centuries afterward absorbed resources on a similar order. Cannot settle the question of exactly how big she was. For that, later writers turned instead to the chroniclers, and here the record becomes even less stable, though no less valuable in its own way. The most often cited description of the Great Michael comes from the 16th century historian Robert Lindsay of Pitscottie, whose Chronicle of Scottish Affairs was written decades after the ship's launch and drew, by his own account, on both documentary sources and the living memory of those who had known her. Pitscottie's Great Michael is a ship of almost mythic proportion, vast in length, thick-walled beyond anything built before her, capable of devouring the forests of Fife in her construction. It is a vivid picture, and it is the picture that has shaped popular memory of the ship ever since. But Pitscottie was writing history in a mode that valued a good and memorable account over a strictly verifiable one, and modern historians have learned to read his numbers with caution rather than as settled fact. He was not present at New Haven when the keel was laid. He was recording, decades on, the kind of story a proud nation likes to tell about its own vanished ambitions, and pride has a way of rounding figures upward. This is not to accuse Pitscottie of invention, so much as to recognize the nature of the material he was working with. Oral memory of a famous ship passed down through a generation or two of Scottish courtiers and sailors would naturally have magnified her scale, even without any intent to deceive. Ships remembered fondly tend to grow larger in the retelling, the way a fish grows longer with each telling of the story of its catch. The Great Michael had, after all, been genuinely remarkable in her own time. The temptation to describe something remarkable in terms that matched its reputation, rather than in terms that a modern archaeologist could verify, was one that a chronicler working within an oral tradition would have found difficult to resist, even had he wished to. The French correspondence adds a further layer and a useful corrective, though it too comes with its own limitations. Once the ship passed into French hands, she appears in naval records and administrative letters connected to the ports where she was kept, and eventually allowed to decay. These sources are more procedural than celebratory. French officials had no particular interest in exaggerating the size or grandeur of a foreign vessel they had purchased and then found themselves unable to maintain. And for that reason, some historians treat the French material as a useful check against the more inflated Scottish memory of the ship. But the French records are also thin, scattered across years, and concerned chiefly with cost and condition, rather than with the kind of technical description that would allow a modern researcher to reconstruct her lines with confidence. They confirm that a great Scottish ship existed, that she required substantial upkeep, and that this upkeep was eventually judged not worth the expense. They do not offer a technical draft of her hull. Given all this, it should come as no surprise that historians disagree sometimes sharply for the particulars. Estimates of her length have varied by tens of feet, depending on which source is trusted and how heavily the writer discounts Pitt Scotty's later account. Estimates of her displacement, how much water she pushed aside, and so how large a vessel she truly was by the measure that matters most to a shipwright, vary correspondingly, since length alone says little without knowledge of beam and depth of hold, both of which are recorded even less consistently than length itself. Her armament, too, remains a matter of careful qualification rather than settled catalogue. The number of guns she carried, the mix of heavy cannon and smaller pieces, the placement of her ordnance along her decks, all of this is described in general terms in the surviving sources with specific figures that do not always agree with one another, and modern historians have tended to present a range rather than a single confident number, noting that any total offered should be understood as an estimate drawn from imperfect testimony rather than an inventory copied from a ship's own muster roll. There is, too, the deeper problem that no archaeology exists to settle any of these questions. Where a wreck can be found, measured, and excavated, the documentary uncertainties surrounding a historic ship can often be resolved by the timbers themselves. A keel that can be measured to the inch, frames that reveal the true beam, fittings that confirm or deny the presence. No such wreck has been confidently identified for the Great Michael. She did not sink in a location that left a clear and recoverable site. She was, so far as the record shows, allowed to rot and eventually to be broken up in a French harbour, her timbers presumably repurposed, burned, or simply left to disintegrate over years of neglect into sexty, in a manner that left no single dramatic wrecking event and so no single site for archaeologists to search. Whatever remained of her physical fabric was almost certainly dispersed long before anyone thought to record where the pieces had gone. This means that everything known about the Great Michael rests on documents and later memory alone, with no timber, no fitting, no surviving keel to arbitrate between the competing figures offered by chronicle and account book. Historians who have studied her have, on the whole, made peace with this condition, rather than treated it as an unsolved case awaiting a final answer. The scholarly literature on the Great Michael tends to present a range of plausible figures for her size and armament, framed always with the caveat that certainty is not available and probably never will be, and to treat Pitt Scotty's account as valuable evidence of how the ship was remembered rather than as a precise technical record of how she was built. This is, in its way, an honest and even a comfortable resolution. Not every vanished ship needs to be pinned down to an exact figure in order to be understood. Sometimes what a ship meant to the people who built her and remembered her is itself the more durable kind of evidence, more telling in the end than a keel length agreed upon to the nearest foot. And so, the uncertainty that surrounds the Great Michael has come to feel, over the centuries, less like an unfortunate gap in the record, and more like a genuine part of her character. She was, from the very beginning, a ship built as much to be talked about as to be sailed. A declaration of royal ambition intended to impress observers who would carry word of her home to Edinburgh and to London and to the courts of Europe, rather than a working vessel whose precise tonnage needed to be recorded for some later purpose. It is fitting, in a way that would perhaps have pleased King James himself, that she survives now chiefly as a story told and retold, argued over by scholars, remembered by a nation with more pride than precision. A ship whose exact size may never be known, but whose outsized presence in the imagination of the country that built her has never required an exact number to be felt. There is a version of the Great Michael's story that has nothing to do with tonnage or gun counts or the price of French oak, and it is perhaps the most durable version of all. It is the story told, not in account books, but around hearths, passed down in the way that great undertakings often are, simplified with each telling until they become something closer to legend than to history. In this telling, the Great Michael did not merely use a great deal of timber. She devoured a forest. She stripped Fife bare. She took, in the popular imagining, every tree the region had to offer, and left behind a landscape that would carry the memory of her building for generations, long after her hull had rotted in a foreign harbor and her guns had been melted down for other purposes. It is a story simple enough for a child to understand and grand enough to satisfy a kingdom's need to believe that its ambitions had once been vast enough to leave a permanent scar upon the land itself. The claim, reduced to its plainest form, holds that the building of the Great Michael consumed the woodlands of Fife so thoroughly that the region never fully recovered its old forest cover, that the king's shipwrights felled with such appetite that the hills around Newhaven and the wooded country further inland were left changed, thinner, and altered in a way that could still be read centuries later by anyone who knew how to look. It is the kind of claim that carries an appealing tidiness. A single ship, one act of construction, one royal ambition, sufficient to reshape an entire landscape. There is something almost mythic in its structure, the sort of story that would not feel out of place, set alongside older tales of giants who moved mountains or heroes who drained lakes with a single effort of will. The Great Michael, in this telling, becomes less a ship and more a force of nature, a devouring presence that passed through the land and left it altered in her wake. The historical record, examined with the patience it deserves, offers a rather different picture, though not one that dismisses the legend so much as it reframes what lies beneath it. It is true, beyond serious dispute, that an extraordinary quantity of timber went into her building. The chronicler who wrote that all the woods in Fife, except Falkland wood, were cut down by her, was not inventing his claim from nothing. He was recording, or perhaps repeating, an impression that had already taken hold among his contemporaries. A sense that the scale of the undertaking had been so vast that it seemed to account for every fallen tree in the region, whether or not that tree had in fact gone into her hull. This is how folk memory often works. It does not distinguish carefully between direct cause and coincidental timing. If the woods of Fife were indeed diminished during those years, whether by the shipbuilding at Newhaven, by ordinary agricultural clearance, by the slower and less dramatic pressures of a growing population needing fuel and pasture and cropland, the ship became the explanation. She was the visible, singular, undeniable cause standing in the foreground, and it was easier and more satisfying to credit her with an entire landscape's transformation than to imagine the slower, duller work of centuries of ordinary use grinding down the same woods by inches. Scholars who have examined the timber question with more care have generally concluded that while the Great Michaels certainly required an immense quantity of wood, and while contemporary accounts consistently describe the king's shipwrights ranging widely across Fife and beyond in search of suitable oak, it is unlikely that a single ship, however vast, could have single-handedly stripped an entire region of established woodland that had grown over generations. Forests of the kind Fife would have held in the early 1500s represented centuries of accumulated growth, and while a determined program of felling for a royal project could certainly make a serious dent in such reserves, particularly among the older, straighter trees most prized for hull timbers and masts, the wholesale erasure implied by the legend asks more of the ship than even her most enthusiastic contemporary admirers likely intended when they first put the claim to paper. What probably occurred, and what the more measured historical accounts suggest, is that the building of the Great Michael accelerated and concentrated a process of woodland clearance that was already underway for other reasons. That the scale of royal demand for the finest and largest trees placed a particular strain on specific stands of old growth that could not easily be replaced, and that the visible dramatic nature of the shipbuilding effort, so different from the slow attrition of ordinary land use, fixed itself in local memory as the single explanation for a change that in truth had many contributing causes. Why such a legend takes root and holds so firmly is itself a question worth sitting with. Scotland in the years of James IV was not a vast kingdom, nor one accustomed to feats of engineering on the scale that larger powers like France or Venice might undertake almost as a matter of course. The Great Michael was, for Scotland, something close to unprecedented, an undertaking so far beyond the ordinary run of royal projects that it demanded an explanation commensurate with its strangeness. A small kingdom that builds an enormous ship needs, in some sense, an enormous story to go with it, a way of understanding what such an effort must have cost, what it must have required, what price the land itself must have paid for so audacious a gesture. The claim that she stripped Fife of its trees serves this need perfectly. It gives the ship a footprint in the landscape that matches her footprint in the imagination. It answers in the most direct and physical terms available the question of just how much a project like this one must have taken from the country that built it. A ship this size, the story seems to say, could not have come from ordinary means. She must have consumed something extraordinary to exist at all. And what more fitting sacrifice for a kingdom to offer than its own old woods? There are even now traces in the landscape and in local memory that keep the legend alive, though they must be approached with the same caution due any claim rooted more in feeling than in documentation. Place names around Fife carry echoes of old woodland long since cleared, names that speak of oak groves and forest tracts where open farmland or rough pasture now lies. Whether these particular clearances trace directly to the king's shipwrights or to centuries of separate agricultural pressure is not always possible to say with confidence, and the honest answer, in most cases, is that no single record survives to settle the matter. Local memory in parts of Fife has long held that certain stretches of country, thin now of the old broadleaf woodland that once would have covered them, owe their bareness to the Great Michael's building, a belief passed down through generations without documentary proof, but with enough persistence to suggest that something real, even if imprecisely remembered, lies beneath it. The absence of ancient woodland in certain parts of the region, verifiable today by anyone who walks the ground, becomes in this telling a kind of monument, a negative space shaped by the ship's construction, the ghost of forests that once stood where now there is only open field. What matters most, perhaps, is not whether the legend can be proven in precise botanical or documentary terms, but what it reveals about the way the great Michael continued to live long after her timbers had rotted away in a French harbour. She became, in the telling and retelling, among the people of Fife and of Scotland, more broadly something larger than a vessel. She became a measure of ambition itself, a story used to explain a changed landscape, a way of holding on to the memory of a moment when a small kingdom reached, however briefly, for something vast. The ship that could not be launched without difficulty, that could not find safe harbour at home, that was sold away within a few short years of her completion, nonetheless found a kind of permanence that her actual hull never achieved. She outgrew her own dimensions, however large or modest those dimensions truly were, and settled instead into the shape of a story, one that would be told at hearths and in histories for centuries after the last of her timbers had gone, a story that needed no precise tonnage or gun count to carry its weight, only the enduring shape of a kingdom's memory of having once, however briefly, dreamed bigger than the land could easily bear. New Haven today gives up nothing of what once happened along its shore. The harbour sits small and quiet on the edge of the Firth of Forth, a working inlet among working inlets, its stone walls holding back a tide that moves the same way it moved 5 centuries ago, indifferent to what was built and unbuilt upon its banks. A visitor walking the shoreline in the early morning, before the fishing boats stir and before the gulls have fully woken to their calling, would find no marker to explain why this particular stretch of coast once drew the attention of a king, why timber from 3 counties was hauled here across roads never meant to bear such weight, why hundreds of men once laboured through the better part of 2 years to raise something the likes of which the Firth had never held. The slipway where the great Michael was built has long since settled back into ordinary ground, reclaimed by grass and silt and the slow, patient work of a coastline that outlasts every ambition set upon it. There is nothing here now to suggest that a ship once so large it strained the language of those who described her ever rested on this spot, waiting to be borne into water that could barely hold her. This is perhaps the quietest and most honest ending the story could have found. No ruin marks the place. No half-sunken timber breaks the surface at low tide to remind the curious of what once stood here. The great Michael left New Haven so completely and so long ago that the very ground has forgotten her, and only the documents remain, scattered across archives and account books, to insist that she was real at all. Standing on that shore, now one understands something that the story of the ship has been quietly teaching all along, that the sea does not keep monuments. It keeps nothing, in fact, except the water itself, which moves on regardless of what has been launched into it or lost beneath it. Whatever the great Michael was, whatever her true length, or her true tonnage, or her true cost in oak and iron and human labour, the Firth of Forth holds no trace of her today, beyond the fact that ships still launch from harbours along this coast, as they have done in an unbroken line since long before her time and long after it. It is worth pausing, in this final quiet, to consider what the great Michael represents beyond the specific facts of her own construction and loss, because her story is not truly singular. It belongs to a much older and much larger pattern, one that repeats itself across the centuries and across the kingdoms of the world, wherever rulers have looked at their treasuries and their forests and their ambitions and decided that all 3 might be spent together in the service of a single overwhelming statement. Scotland was neither the first nor the last nation to empty its woodlands in pursuit of a vessel meant to announce its arrival among greater powers. The pattern is old. It is in some ways as old as kingship itself, this instinct to build something too large for practical purpose, something whose true function is not to sail or to fight, but to be seen, to exist as proof that a small nation on the edge of Europe could summon resources equal to its neighbours, if only for the span of a single hull. James IV was neither foolish nor unusual in this. He was, if anything, entirely typical of rulers who came before him and rulers who had come after, men and women who looked at the accumulated wealth of their reigns and asked what single object might best demonstrate that wealth to a watching world. Forests have fallen for such purposes many times over, in many countries, under many crowns. Fife's woodlands were not the first to be measured out against a royal ambition, and they would not be the last landscape anywhere to bear the physical cost of a ruler's desire to be remembered as great. There is something almost universal in this exchange: timber traded for glory, labor traded for legacy, and it is this universality that gives the story of the great Michael its lasting resonance, far beyond the specific waters of the Forth or the specific fortunes of the Stuart dynasty. She stands, in the end, as one example among many of a pattern human societies have repeated wherever wood grew tall enough and ambition burned hot enough to consume it. And yet the deeper meditation the story offers is not simply about waste, though waste is certainly part of it. It is about impermanence, about the strange asymmetry between the enormous effort required to build something and the comparatively brief span of time such things endure once built. The forests of Fife took generations to grow into the great oaks that shipwrights felled for the great Michael's hull. The ship herself lasted, by any reasonable accounting, only a handful of years in Scottish hands before she passed into French service and slipped from the record entirely. The court that commissioned her, the king who dreamed her into existence, did not survive her by even a full year, dying at Flodden before her keel had properly weathered its first seasons at sea. Kingdoms reach for greatness through wood and iron, spend their forests and their treasuries in pursuit of a single defining object, and then, more often than history is comfortable admitting, the objects themselves outlive neither the ambition that built them. What outlives everything, in the end, is not the ship herself, but the story of the ship, a tale that continues to be told long after the timber has rotted or burned or been quietly broken apart for scrap in some foreign harbour whose name barely survives the telling. This is perhaps the truest shape of the great Michael's legacy. She did not endure as wood and iron. She endures as narrative, as the memory of a moment when a small northern kingdom reached further than its resources could comfortably support, and in reaching, left behind not a wreck to be excavated or a hull to be measured, but a story shaped instead by absence, by the gap between what was claimed and what can be proven, by the forests that vanished and the ship that followed them into uncertainty soon after. Great ships, it turns out, do not need to survive in order to matter. They need only to have existed long enough and vividly enough in the accounts of those who saw them to plant themselves in the memory of a people who would go on telling the story long after the physical evidence had disappeared entirely. Picture then one final image as the true and lasting close of the account, the water of the Firth of Forth at first light, still and pale, holding no shape of hull or scaffold, no shadow of the great vessel that once rose from this shore. The forests of Fife have grown back in the centuries since, slowly, unevenly, the way forests do when left to their own patient rhythms, and somewhere among those renewed woodlands stand oaks that have no memory of their predecessors. No knowledge that this same ground once gave up its timber for a ship meant to announce a kingdom's arrival among the great powers of its age. The water does not remember either. It simply moves, as it always has, indifferent to kings and shipwrights and the vast ambitions once launched upon its surface, carrying the tide in and out along a shore that has forgotten, in every way that matters to stone and soil, that the great Michael was ever built here at all. And so the story closes, not with iron or oak, but with stillness, with a harbour at dawn that asks nothing of those who visit it and offers no answers beyond what the quiet itself suggests. that ambition is real, and forests are real, and ships once rose enormous from small shores to prove a kingdom's worth, and all of it, in time, settles back into water and silence, remembered now only in the telling. If this quiet chronicle of a vanished giant has held your attention through its slow unfolding, there are other great ships waiting in the same patient way, other harbors and other timbers and other kingdoms who once reached further than they could hold, gathered gently on this channel for whenever you might wish to return to them.